This one says, "Who is your favorite philosopher in all of history and why?" And that's something that I've always been curious about as well.
That's kind of tricky because I like different philosophers for different reasons.
Right.
Like if it's just all around philosopher, I kind of like the three who set it off. There were philosophers before Socrates. They're called the pre-Socratic. So that's like Thales, Heraclitus, Anaximander, people like that. But they generally focused on some very specific question. Usually, what is everything made of? Socrates takes things in a more moral and political direction as far as the kinds of questions he's asking. And so that's where, that's kind of the beginning of a kind of different kind of philosophy that's going on. But I mean, if I were to make a, list of the 10 most brilliant people of all time, like three of them were right there back to back. Plato,
Right.
I mean, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, the thing is, we don't know a tremendous amount about Socrates because it all comes, most of our knowledge about Socrates comes through Plato.
Right.
And so we don't know how faithful he's being. We know he's using Socrates as a character
Right.
for a lot of his own ideas. And so
Right.
how much of it actually goes back to Socrates, how much of it actually goes is the ideas of Plato. But we know a lot about Plato and Aristotle. But if I had to pick a sort of favorite philosopher of all time, who's all around philosopher, I'd probably go with Aristotle. Aristotle said that all men by nature desire to know. I can't verify that as far as everyone else is concerned, but it's certainly
Right.
true of Aristotle.
Right.
Plato's writing his material, but he's writing it in like dialogue form. He's writing in terms of like discussions and so on. And I actually like that approach, but it's Aristotle who sits down and says, let's put together everything we can know about physics. Let's put together everything we can know about zoological researches and stuff like this. And like he would assemble everything that could be known on these various topics, and that just hadn't occurred to anyone before him. And so he tries to systematize like everything that could be known at his time, and along the way he just invents entire fields. So logical laws, they're foundational to thought. They've always existed, but logic as a thing you study, Aristotle invents that. He invents logic as a field of study. He invents biology too. So he's simultaneously a philosopher and a scientist. There was no distinction between them back
Right,
then.
right.
So he invents biology as far as, hey, let's go out and study organisms and put them together. And it's just amazing. You can read passages from his zoological researches where he's talking about various creatures like the octopus and so on. And it sounds like it comes out of a 21st century textbook. They were so detailed in trying to understand these different creatures. So I'd go with Aristotle.
Cool.
Now, with that said, there are other philosophers I like for more specific reasons. Like, I may not agree with their ideas, but I really like something else about them. Like Thomas Reid, I like that he's what's called a common sense philosopher, in that
Oh.
if you get too far away from common sense, there's probably a problem in your philosophy.
Right.
And he also had some epic burns, considering that he's in the 18th century, and he's kind of Hume's nemesis, and he's battling against the skeptics. But he would say things, and they don't make sense today. But in the 18th century, these were like epic burns. Like he was saying, someone who would deny his own existence or his own his own consciousness. He would start saying about the people who are like hyper skeptics. Yeah. He would say they don't need metaphysics and logic. They need a physic and good regimen. Now, notice he's drawing a parallel between metaphysics and physic, right?
Yeah.
He's saying you don't need metaphysics, which is like metaphysical argumentation, what philosophers do. He's saying you need a physic. Now, a physic in the 18th century, that was their word for a laxative. So he's saying, if you're arguing like a hyper skeptic, I'm not going to give you an argument. I'm going to give you a laxative because you're full of crap, right? I mean, no. Notice once you figure out what he's saying, that's like a pretty funny part. Now, I'm not done because this is an important question. One more that I like, just if we're talking about someone like that having some
Right.
burns, the all-time just epic burn master in philosophy was Diogenes. It was called Diogenes the Cynic or Diogenes the Dog, right? And he's a contemporary of Plato, and a really, really weird dude. He would reject certain moral conventions, right? Like they caught him masturbating in public. Right? Caught this guy masturbating in public, and they said, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" And he goes, "I only wish that I could satisfy my hunger by rubbing my belly." Right? And so he's a really, really weird dude, right?
Right.
But he would just just burn people all the time. They cast him out of a city. They said, "Hey, the leaders have sentenced you to exile," and he says, "Well, I sentence them to stay where they are." and he's just happy to leave. And so he goes to live in Athens, and apparently back then you wouldn't eat in public. It was considered like you were like, they called him the dog, right? It was considered like a dog if you're eating in public. You eat behind closed doors and so on. And so he would just sit out there, eating, sitting on the ground, and a crowd would gather around him and say, "Look at him, eating out in public like a dog." He goes, "Well, dogs sit there and watch people who are eating. So you guys are the ones who are like dogs here, aren't you?" So he kept doing this, and eventually he. Now, we don't know how much of this was authentic and how much of this is sort of later legend and so on, but apparently Alexander the Great came to the city when he was in Corinth, and Alexander the Great had an interest in philosophers. He was tutored by Aristotle himself. So he went and when he got to a city, he would apparently go and look for philosophers. And so he heard Diogenes was there, and he came up to Diogenes, who used to live in a barrel on the ground. He would just sleep in a barrel. And Aristotle came along, and he's just lying. Diogenes is just lying in the sun. And Alexander came along and said, "Hey, I heard you're a philosopher. Is there anything I could do for you?" And he said, "Yes, get out of my light." And I was talking to Alexander the Great here. And later, right after that, Alexander the Great said, "If I weren't Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." And Diogenes said, "If I weren't Diogenes, I would still want to be Diogenes." And still later, Diogenes is sitting there looking at a pile of bones, and Alexander comes up to him and says, "What are you doing here, looking at these bones?" He's going, "Oh, I was looking for the bones of your father, Philip of Macedon, but I can't distinguish his bones from the bones of a slave." Now think about the point he's making right there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing all this great stuff and you're getting famous, but at the end of the day, I can't distinguish the bones of Philip of Macedon from the bones of a slave.
Yeah.
And that's the guy who, according to legend, would walk around with a lamp during the daylight. And people would say, "What are you doing?" He'd say, I'm looking for an honest man. I can't find one." And I mean, think about that, right? Because
So he was the first troll.
yeah, he's a perfect troll. And I'll give you an example, but I mean, think about that, right?
Yeah.
Because we can learn lessons from that.
Yeah,
He's walking around with a lantern. That automatically makes people think, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And then you can answer them. I mean, think about a Christian could do that, right?
Yeah.
A Christian could walk through the streets of New York with a lantern. And people say, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for a righteous man.
Right.
I can't find one. Seems like we need a savior." You go right into a gospel presentation.
Yeah.
You could walk on the subway and do that, right?
Yeah.
But as far as trolling, he used to troll Plato in Athens, right? So Plato would be giving his lectures, and Diogenes would walk in with his dinner and start eating dinner at Plato's lecture, like Plato's there for his amusement and so on, like it's theater. And like Plato would give his definition, and Plato apparently it was apparently jokingly he tried to give a definition of a man, and he said he's a featherless biped, right? Walks on two legs,
Right.
Walks on 2 feet, but he's featherless because they're birds who walk on 2 feet. So he said, "Man is a featherless biped." And Diogenes went out, plucked a chicken, and came back in and said, "Look, everyone, I've found a man." A plucked chicken and so on. So this guy was like constantly ticking everyone off. Anyway, again, I don't like the morally, guy who masturbates in public, kind of creepy. But as far as like him, that's the original. Socrates kind of a troll, but this guy just takes it to another level here.
That's good. Yeah, no.
So that was kind of a long answer, but if someone wanted to know,
that's interesting.
got my answer.
What about, this is my kind of question. Modernly, is there, without trying to single anybody out, are there some people that you get more influence from, or?
I mean, there are lots of cool Christian philosophers nowadays. If you're talking about in apologetics, it would be like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland and so on. Those guys are cool. As far as like someone who's like in mainstream academic philosophy and still making advances, because people think of philosophy as not advancing, right?
Right.
Or science is advancing and so on. But no, there are changes in philosophy. You can go from everyone taking this side to everyone taking a different side and so on. So as far as someone, someone who's making, changes in philosophy today, Alvin Plantinga, of course.
Right.
Probably a few others like Dallas Willard. I would like him for a different reason than I would like Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
He's more of like as far as like deep insights into Christian being a Christian and so on. Dallas Willard's got cool stuff. So anyway, there are lots of cool philosophers today. But so historically, I mean, David Hume. I love Hume. I don't agree
Right.
with his arguments, but I love
Right,
like
right.
his approach and the way
Yeah,
he
yeah.
argued and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think so too.
You know, Aristotle, lots of pagan philosophers and so on. But as far as today, I tend
Yeah.
to like Christian philosophers today.
Cool.